So the way the Torah was given was the Jews came out of Egypt, reached Mount Sinai after seeing many miracles. Okay? They heard God's voice in the Ten Commandments, and then Moshe went up to heaven for 40 days to receive the Torah to give it over to the Jews. So during this time, Hashem taught him everything. So if you owned a Torah at that time, the Torah was in Moshe's mind and heart. The Jews heard the Ten Commandments, but that's not the whole Torah. Okay, so skipping over why Moshe had to go up and pray again because they did the golden calf, okay, which the prayer period, by the way, is during the calendar time, is Elul. This is when he was praying for forgiveness. On Yom Kippur, God said he forgave them. This is one of the reasons why Yom Kippur is a day of forgiveness.
The 40 days when he was at the top of the...
Yeah, right. So there were 40 original days, then he saw the golden calf being done. Okay, then time to deal with that, and then another 40 days of prayer and supplication. So this is this period of time. And in fact, I'm going to digress and tell you a little bit more about this period of time, since it's important to be attuned to what you're living with. So the Hebrew months have Babylonian names, which is a very interesting thing. So the reason why we didn't rename them Hebrew names is because the fact that we survived the Babylonian exile means we could bring holiness to any place in the world, in any situation. So the last of all of the months in the Hebrew calendar is this month, which is called Elul. So Elul actually works out that the letters stand for the phrase, Ani lidodi v'dodi li, I'm for my beloved, and my beloved is for me. So this recalls the days of prayer that Moshe was like addressing himself to Hashem, and Hashem answered him. So this is called the month of compassion and forgiveness. So the compassion and forgiveness that Hashem showed us is what we're supposed to try to show to ourselves and also to other people. So the main practice of this month is, in a literal sense, trying to gain forgiveness from anybody who you may have harmed, and for being open to forgive anybody who may have harmed you. So the premise is the only way a person could really seriously forgive someone is if they trust God. So I want to explain this to you. When it comes to something small, like someone spills soup on your shirt and they say, I'm so sorry, and you think they're sincere, you could forgive them easily because it's only a shirt. But suppose somebody did something major to you that can't be fixed. You know, like imagine like a doctor makes a terrible mistake while doing a surgery that can't be rectified. So he could be very sincere in asking forgiveness, but could you truly forgive him? If he removed the wrong lung or the wrong breast or the wrong whatever, you know, what could you do? So if you trusted God that whatever the outcome of an event is was his will for you, it's easier for you to let go to your anger towards the person who's the one who brought that will about. So concerning this, it says in the Talmud, God has many bears and many lions, meaning he could make a negative event happen in a million ways. So let's say, for instance, a person is supposed to suffer financial loss. So one way that could happen is by having a fire. That's a terrible thing. It's much less terrible to have a financial loss because your stocks went down. It's still better to have a financial loss because your daughter got married. There goes $50,000, okay, clear? So Hashem can bring about the same event by many, many different ways. So the human part is their choice making. So if the person truly regrets their choice, that's really all a human being could do, except in situations where payment would help. Okay, clear? So you have to try to let go of anger that you may have towards people who could have done you irreparable damage. So an example of that would be many people grew up in difficult families. So that can't be repaired. Your parents can't become new people and re-bring you up. But you could let go of it. You could say, I was meant to suffer a certain amount of rejection or criticism or whatever to strengthen me, to give me more sensitivity or whatever. And this is how it happened. My parents were probably doing what they could do, given their own personalities, their own upbringing, etc. So that's what Elul is about. So Moshe received the entire Torah, which is huge. When he went back down from the mountain, he was told by God, so this is after Yom Kippur, he slowly, over the next years, how much to reveal to the people. At the end of that time, he was told what to write down. The majority of it was not written down. So the written part is called Torah shebichtav, which means written Torah. And the non-written down part is called Torah shebal peh, which means oral Torah, the Torah of the mouth. Why do you think not everything was written down? God could do whatever he wants. He could have sent Moshe down the mountain with a wagon full of microchips. And so I want you to think about how people learn in a way that's integrated. You could learn from a teacher, you could learn from experience, and you could learn from books, and all of these are valid and they have different advantages and disadvantages. So what's the advantage of learning from a teacher rather than a book?
You can ask questions.
You could ask questions. So what that means is that when people just have a book, they oftentimes will have questions, figure out their own answers, which may or may not be right, and integrate them as though it was right. So you have, like, I'm sure when you were in school you studied literature at some point. Did you have to read Moby Dick? Do they make you read Moby Dick anymore? One of the many things you should not regret in life is, so it's supposed to be the great American novel. It's so boring, like 9 chapters on the whaling industry, terrible. So in any case, it begins with the words, "Call me Yishmael." That was like one of the heroes' names. So there are all of these literary critics who will write, why did Melville choose Yishmael as the name of his main character? So Yishmael was a wanderer, he was rejected and then accepted. But do we know what's true? No, it's all suppositions. It has nothing to do with anything that could be demonstrated because Melville is gone. For all we know, his landlord's name was Yishmael, and he said, I'll forgive you 2 months' rent if you put me in the book. So that's the big disadvantage of book learning. What's the advantage of book learning? Well, you can go back. And also words sometimes, the selection of words. If it's done by a good author, the selection of words are important. Okay? Okay, what's the advantage of learning from a teacher? So one is that you could ask questions. And if the teacher is astute, even if you don't know you have a question, the teacher will figure out that you have a question. You know what it like if the students go, okay. Or if the teacher's any good, she can see if the students are lost, you know. So, you know, to get their attention, tell a story, whatever it is. So a teacher could see that the learning really happens, but you can't go back to the same moment as easily. Okay, experiential learning, okay, what's its advantage and disadvantage? Do you know what I mean when I say experiential? Probably nobody ever told you that when you go on the train, you shouldn't take out a scissors and cut off somebody's ponytail. No one ever told you this, right? But you know. So how do you know? This is called experiential learning, social cues. From your experience in life, you learn that people who harm other people don't get away with it easily. So you learned through observation. So the advantage of experiential learning is that it's integrated. No one has to talk about it, it's there. Okay, so the Torah was given on all 3 levels. So at the end of the 40 years, the 5 books of Moses was written down. So I'm going to take you through their names and what's in them. And then I'll talk to you about the oral law and experiential learning.
So Moses didn't receive like the whole thing?
It was all in his head, but he didn't write it until God told him to write it.
Over how long a period?
Okay, so the actual writing did not take a long time, but he was teaching it in bits and pieces over 40 years. Okay, so getting down to what's in the books of Torah. There are 5 books. The first one is called Bereshit, which means in the beginning. It's all narrative. Okay, so the purpose of the narrative and narratives in Torah in general is to get you to identify with the characters whose lives are being discussed, so you could learn something through their example. So this takes you from the creation all the way to the story of Joseph. That's the first book, which is called Bereshit. The second book is called Shemot. The word Shemot means names. So it begins with giving the names of the 70 people who went down with Yaakov to Egypt because of a famine that had taken place. They're the core of the Jewish people. So this really is, it's also called the Book of Redemption. It talks about how we were forged into being a people through the experiences in Egypt and through the miracles of the redemption. So this book has the Egypt story, the story of the 10 Commandments, okay, and it ends with building the sanctuary, which is like the ultimate fruition of who we are as a people. Third book is called Vayikra, which means and he called. This is God calling out to Moshe. And this contains most of the mitzvot. He called him and said this and do that and tell them the other. Okay. The fourth book is called Bamidbar, which means in the desert. So these are the events that took place in the desert when we had no external social frame, so we weren't picking up other people's mores. It has all of the narratives of who we are when we're left to ourselves, plus many laws. The last book is called Dvarim, which means words. They're the words that were spoken by Moshe right before his death, meaning his selection of what he considers to be the most important lessons for them to know. Okay, clear? So those are the 5 books of the written law. The written law is interpretable on 4 levels, so get this, okay? So the first level is called Pshat, which means the simple level. It means keep Shabbat, okay, yeah? Don't do the forbidden actions, which have to do with building the tabernacle. It commemorates God's ceasing creation on the 7th day, okay? That's the simplest level. Okay, above that is remez. Remez means hint. What does this all allude to? Why 7? God could have made the world in 6 days, in 12 days, however he wanted. What does the number 7 allude to? Why is it called Shabbat and not called Shvi'i, which means 7? Okay, why do we do these particular things and not those? Okay, so it's taking us into understanding what every aspect of the mitzvah hints at. Okay, one level in, a level deeper, is called drush, which means meaning. What does creation mean? Why did God stop at a certain point? What does keeping Shabbos mean? Why is it unique to the Jewish people? Okay, clear? The deepest level of all is called sod, which means secret, which is about God or about the soul. So this is also called Kabbalah. So it'll answer something like, and what existed before time? Okay, does God keep Shabbos, and if so, how? Okay, you know, things like that. Okay, so everything in the Torah is interpretable on all 4 levels. So you have to work, though, from the outside in. You can't work from the inside out, because otherwise you lose its meaning. Okay, clear? So as we said, a lot of the Torah remained oral, and the reason was, for the reasons that we said ourselves, everyone should have a teacher who could convey it to them on their level using the words that the person will understand. So the system was, for teaching, that every village had to have 3 people who were in charge of the transmission. Every parent had to teach their children. So in Judaism, homeschooling is the way to go. Now, in an agricultural society, this works more easily than it would in an industrial society or a service-oriented society. Why? Because the children were with their parents all day long. So the boys were out in the field, the girls were in the kitchens or in the vegetable gardens, on the threshing floor. They were in contact with their parents continually, so finding the moments for teaching wasn't so hard. Okay, this system had a backup. The backup was, if there was any disagreement about what actually the law was, so the parents would have to have, in any village, there had to be 3 people who were like certified to deal with very limited things. Or it would go to a higher court till you get to the 70 elders in Jerusalem who were testably perfect in the entire Torah. So there was a checks and balance system to see that things didn't get perverted. This worked for a long time. Why did it stop working? When I say a long time, I'm talking about around 1,000 years. So that's a long time. And there was no significant disagreement about what the tradition was up to that point. What happened was the Roman persecutions and oppression. So one of the things that the Romans did when they conquered Israel was the big hoard in Jerusalem. They replaced it with their own people. So what does that mean concretely? If their own people are in the Sanhedrin, what does that mean? It means that the tradition has no more checks and balances. Okay, clear? So at that point, a critical decision was made. 2 decisions. One is education has to be community. It can't be left to the parents, because the parents, in the situation of poverty and persecutions that they had, weren't able to commit to teaching to their children the way they should. So Yoshua ben Gamla, this is a name you should remember, Yoshua ben Gamla instituted free public education. When did the Goyim catch up with this? How many years later? 2,000 years later, the non-Jewish world caught up with the idea that every child should be educated. But I say free, the teacher had to be paid, but every town had to have a school, so the money wasn't only taken from the parents. Okay, clear? Okay, so education began in a formal system. I'm going to digress and tell you what a school has to be like from a halachic view in a moment. But something much more radical happened. They began writing down the oral law because it would have been lost. So the first part of the oral law to be written down is called Mishnah. Mishnah is in 6 books. It's written in outline form, very clear Hebrew. Children learn Mishnah even, it's clear. But it's only an outline, so you still need a teacher to fill everything in, but you have something to work with, so you're not totally lost without a teacher. Let's digress and go to what a school should look like. So, do either of you teach? Uh-huh. Okay, so it would have been more interesting if you did. Okay, so the maximum class size is meant to be 25 children. If there's between 12 and 25 children, the teacher should have an assistant. But if there's more than 25 children, then there should be a second class. Okay, clear? So it's a limitation to how many children a teacher should be teaching. Children should begin education, even though in today's society children start going to school at a very young age. When do children start nowadays? When do mommies send the babies out?
I went at 4.
4, 3. Okay, 3, 4. Today they even send them out younger. Do you know this? Like 2. Okay, which I think is so ridiculous. Whatever, I have my own opinions on this. They have, even in the religious community also, they have these things called ma'on, which are like daycare. You could send from 3 months. Okay, you know, just get your little briefcase, here's your lunch. You know, so in any case, so in halacha, school has to begin at 6 or 7. You have the option of sending earlier. It's permitted, but you don't have to send to 6 or 7. Okay. What's meant to be taught in school? So the parents, on an individual basis, have the responsibility of teaching their children how to survive life, learn to swim, have a trade. What has to be taught in school is Torah. Okay, the school has to happen during daylight hours, okay, till the evening, meaning it's meant to be a full day. And the teacher has to be somebody who likes children, which I know should sound like self-understood, but no, it's not. And should maintain discipline with the children and take responsibility for this, that they actually learn. So from a halachic view, the perfect teacher is somebody who's a good role model and who's committed to seeing the children actually learn. So again, in secular education as it's done today, a lot of playing is done in school. So playing is important, but it doesn't have to be done in school. It could be done in recess, at lunchtime with the parents. The teachers have serious responsibilities to teach. Okay, so that basically is what school's about. Children were not obligated to go to school like till way up. In an agricultural society, they began working when they were able to work. But they had the skills of learning. So once a child has the skill of learning, once they're literate, then they could learn on their own. Okay, clear? Okay, so that's the Mishnaic age. So after the Mishnah was written, the person who wrote it is called Rav Yehuda Hanasi. This is a name worth your knowing. Okay, the Roman persecutions got better or worse? What do you think? Better or worse? Worse. This is in Jewish history. Yeah. You always like, okay, you never lose when you have that. Okay, and then things got worse. Okay, so because of that, having an outline was not good enough. You had to have everything filled in, all the exceptions, all of the logic, all of the possibilities of adjudicating new cases. So what happened next was that the Gemara was written. The Gemara has 63 volumes. It's a tough read. It's written in the Aramaic language using Hebrew letters. So could you imagine like seeing English in Hebrew letters? Like bye-bye would be bet, yud, yud, bet, yud, yud. It's written in Aramaic using Hebrew letters. It wanders. Do you know what I mean when I say it wanders? We're talking about a certain case. So a certain scholar presented his opinion. But gosh, if we're talking about him, he also has opinions on various other cases we mentioned previously. Okay, while we're talking about those, look at the reasoning. The reasoning is actually similar to reasoning that was used elsewhere. Okay, and then there's this whole body of law called the Baraita, which are things that were not included in the Mishnah. So we don't even know always where the Talmud is coming from when they quote a Baraita. Like, where is this Baraita? So in addition to this, it reads sometimes like this enormous long run-on sentence, like a 2-volume run-on sentence, as the beginnings and ends are not always so clear. So why do you think it was written in such a very cryptic manner? So the reason is that the goal was for the information to be presented, but to necessitate a teacher. So that there would still be contact between the student and a teacher, if not every day, if not every hour, at least sometimes, because otherwise you can't chop through it. So it is a tough read. It's meant to be a tough read. If you do 2 sides of a page a day, it takes 7 years to go through it. Two sides of a page a day, doing it on the most superficial possible level is around an hour. So that gives you a picture of what it is. If a person wants to study this in a serious way, where they really know what they're talking about, and they know the underlying logic behind everything they're learning, in most learning frames, they'll learn like 1 segment for a whole term. It's like, it's that much. Okay, so what wasn't put into the Talmud all that much, although some of it was all of the hard stuff. Remember, we spoke about Kabbalah, we spoke about meaning. So the way the Talmud is constructed is it's around 70% law and 30% everything else. So the everything else includes narratives, mystic stuff, history, interesting stories. So the 30% that isn't law is probably the more difficult part, because we don't have that much commentary on it, and it's hard to find the meaning behind a lot of this. It's called Agada. So the Talmud is divided between Halacha and Agada. Mishnah and Gemara together are called Talmud. Okay, now taking this one step further. So the whole mystic tradition, why wasn't it written down the same way everything else was written down? So the reason is you can only talk about what something means if you know what it says, and in the case of mysticism, if you've integrated what it said. So basic mystic ideas were handed down still in an oral form throughout this era. Okay, the exception to that is one of the Talmudic scholars, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he actually is in the Mishnah, okay, made a circle of scholars around himself, and before his death, he composed the Zohar, which is the backbone of Jewish mysticism. But the Zohar was given over like in lecture form, so there were all sorts of portfolios of it. It was only edited in the Middle Ages. Okay, so the Zohar that we have today is all of the different portfolios put together in an edited form. The editing was done by someone called Moshe de Leon. It makes it also, besides that the topics are hard, almost impossible, but the sequencing is very difficult. Okay, so that basically is the beginnings of Torah. Okay, so the ideal was for everyone to know everything, either experientially, by seeing how the life is lived, or intellectually by studying. So if you get to the Second Temple era, people knew either intellectually or experientially. Then we have the exile. And Jews scattered. So the original, where do you think they went from Israel? Where would you go if you couldn't live you couldn't bear living under the Roman oppression any longer? Where could you go? So originally the Jews went mostly to other places in the Roman Empire, in Byzantine, Southern Europe, etc. They went from there, the migration went from there to Asia Minor, down to North Africa, up to Middle Europe. So this is where, at the era I'm talking to you about, Jews are living. The Jews who lived in Asia Minor and North Africa are called Sephardim. The ones who live in Europe are called Ashkenazim. Okay? So Rambam lived in Spain, which although it's in Europe, it's in Southern Europe, so it's still considered Sephardi. He saw a problem. What was the problem? The problem was that the average person no longer had this kind of time for scholarship. So what he wrote is a sort of encyclopedia of everything Jewish. So that's called Mishnah Torah, not to be confused with Mishnah. Mishnah Torah. It's in 14 volumes, which is as short as you could possibly get. It's written in extremely clear Mishnaic Hebrew, with paragraphs, with chapter headings, with tables of contents. This is like such relief from Talmud. So in Mechina, we're going to be learning from Mishnah Torah. Okay, now it's in 14 volumes. Have a guess. Which volume do you think we're going to be learning in Mechina? Volume number? I knew you'd get it. Okay. Now, volume number 1 is divided into 5 topics. Which topic do you think we're beginning with?
That's one.
I knew you'd get it. So I'll tell you which ones that we tried to get through in the 6 weeks of Mechina. Okay, so the first one is called Yesodei Torah, which means the foundations of Torah, which are all of the basic beliefs. Okay, the second one that we'll be learning is about personality, and the third one is about return to God. So my feeling is that we should begin, because you've heard a lot on the foundations of Torah, have you not? Or have you? You haven't. So we're going to start with number 1 then, okay. Good. Okay, so we shall begin right now. So he begins by saying the foundation of foundations and the pillar of wisdom is knowing that there's a force that brought everything about. So I want to look at his wording. Why does a building actually need a foundation? How does it work? Like if you built a building without a foundation, like think Lego buildings you may have made, why do they fall down? Why, if you make a big hole and put it in the hole, does it not fall down?
It's like it supports the ground.
The ground supports it, okay? So what we're saying is that there are some supports that you have to have for any moral system. If not, the system will fall apart as soon as the wind blows. Okay, clear? So he says the foundation of all foundations is knowing that nothing makes itself. So I want to digress. When I say nothing makes itself, let's think about what you learned when you were studying science. So you learned a definition of the scientific method, did you not? Do you remember this? So for something to be considered a scientific fact, it has to be observable, definable, and repeatable. Okay. So if it's not, it could be a theory. The fact that something can't be repeated doesn't mean it's not true, but it's not considered a fact unless it meets all 3 criteria. Where would you put the idea of this, nothing makes itself? Is that definable? Yes, nothing makes itself. Is it repeatable? Nobody has ever seen anything make itself. Okay, is that true or not? Okay, so it's observable, definable, repeatable. So I think it's reasonable to take this as a scientific thought that nothing makes itself. And if you'd want to be sophisticated, so well, maybe something does make itself, and we just haven't seen it. So although that's not scientific, as soon as you say we haven't seen it, you've taken it off the page. But you would have to ask yourself, just using basic logic, when did it make itself? Did it make itself before it was there or after it was there? So nothing makes itself. So when you were back in school and they were teaching you how things came into being, what were the explanations your teachers gave you? How did everything come into being?
Do you know the universe?
Yeah, how did it come into being?
Big Bang?
So here's how the Big Bang works. I want to review the Big Bang with you. You could approach the Big Bang from different angles. The easiest one in terms of observable is through astronomy. So here you have 2 stars. They're like this in the sky from what you see. Does that mean that they're an inch apart? No, it means that they're thousands of miles apart, but this is what you see, right? Tomorrow they'll be like this. The day after they'll be like this. The day after they'll be like this. The day after, okay. So that's called the expanding universe. So it means if it's like this today, it was like this yesterday, and like this the day before, like that, until there must have been a point where all of this energy and matter was in one place, and then for reasons unknown, it imploded, and that's where everything came from. What are some questions that are still not answered?
Where did that initial mass come?
Where did all of these things, whether you call it matter or energy, there are different ways of approaching it, where they get, who made them, where they come from? What force is bringing them together? So the answer would be electromagnetic force. How did it get there? So no matter what you reduce things to, the very simple question is, how did it get there? It doesn't disappear. So with the Big Bang Theory, they don't attempt to answer it. Do you realize this? So they would just say, this is what happened, and this is what happened subsequently. But even in physics, especially when you get to quantum mechanics, what they come down to is we can't see it. We can't see the force that brought everything about. So the reason we can't see it, they'll say, is because if you're here, you're seeing only things, everything from the perspective of here, which is a limitation. But that doesn't mean anything could make itself. Okay, so what Rambam is saying when he calls that the foundation of all foundations is once you say that nothing made itself, that there's a force that brought everything about, then you could recognize that you're an effect and there's a cause for your existence. So we're not going to use the word God yet to describe this cause because the word God is loaded. But just recognizing that you didn't make yourself, you're part of something bigger than you, is an important thing. It's the foundation of foundations. Okay, now the trick about using the word God is that when people use the word God in today's society, what do they image out?
Very human image.
Big guy in the sky with a long white beard. Okay, so that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a non-physical force. In Hebrew, the word for God is Hashem, which means the name. The name we're referring to, Yud Kei Vav Kei, means was, is, will be. Okay, so we're talking about being. We're not talking about anything physical. So Rambam goes on, and he says, as soon as you say that this force isn't physical, here's some things you know about it. You can't put numbers to it. You can't say it's 2 or 5 or 3, because numbers are physical. Numbers have beginnings and ends. If you're talking about infinity, where does infinity 1 end and infinity 2 begin? Also, it's not describable in terms of color, size. So all of the things that are major features in other religions don't work for our definition of God. That makes sense to you? So when you say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hashem, hear Israel, Hashem is our God, He's one. You don't mean one like the first of a sequence, like 1, 2, 3. And you don't mean one like one of the objects on the desk. You mean the one from which everything comes. Okay, that's clear to you? So here's where this leaves you concretely. If everything comes from this one cause, there's a certain level of equality and holiness to everything that exists. Meaning if you're the effect of God's causality, so is he, so is she, so is the Arab over there who's throwing a rock at a car, so is the rock itself. Okay, clear? So everything is part of what we would call God's will. This makes sense? So now let's concretize this. Now that you know this, what does that do for you? Okay, once you know that everything indeed is interconnected and purposeful, you view the world completely different. Okay, clear? So that's why it's the foundation of foundations, because everything about the way you see yourself in the world will change when you think about this. So that's it for today.